Hello everyone, welcome to my channel SW Metro official channel. Meri stands up to Kody in heated family feud. Meri had occupied a paradoxical and painful position within the family structure. As the first wife, she held a title of historical significance but little practical power. She was the cornerstone upon which the entire edifice was built, yet she had been treated as the most disposable. Her relationship with Kody had been a slow, agonizing erosion, from the foundational intimacy of their monogamous beginnings to the barren wasteland it had become, a process painfully documented by her own longing glances and his palpable aversion to her touch. The catfishing scandal was less a cause of their rift and more a symptom of it, a desperate act of a woman starving for connection, which Kody then used as the ultimate justification for his permanent withdrawal. He had weaponized her vulnerability, holding it over her head as an unassailable reason for his coldness, while simultaneously demanding her unwavering loyalty to a family structure that offered her nothing but loneliness. In previous confrontations, Meri's approach had been one of tearful frustration or defensive justification, her words often dissolving into sobs under the weight of Kody's gaslighting and the judgmental stares of her sister wives. She fought, but she fought from a position of perceived weakness, always seeking to prove her worth, to earn back a place she never truly lost but had been forcibly evicted from. This time, however, was different. The feud ignited over the ridiculous yet symbolically critical issue of the rules for a reconciliation between the Flagstaff and Utah factions of the family. Kody, in a display of controlling petulance, had drafted a list of arbitrary and stringent commandments about sanitizing mail, changing clothes, and social distancing, that felt less about public health and more about asserting dominance. As Robin, the obedient wife, nodded along in performative concern, and Christine and Janelle voiced their practical objections, Meri saw an opening not just to debate pandemic protocols, but to challenge the very nature of her exile. When Kody began his familiar routine of blaming others for his unhappiness, lamenting that no one respected his authority as the head of the family, Meri did the unthinkable. She agreed with him, but then pivoted with the precision of a surgeon. "I'm here," she stated, her voice steady, cutting through his self-pitying monologue. "I've been following the rules. I've been alone. What more can I possibly do?" This was not the plea of a desperate woman, it was the pointed question of a litigator presenting Exhibit A to the jury. She was holding up a mirror to his neglect, forcing him to see the logical conclusion of his own demands. She had done everything he asked, isolated herself in her large, empty house, been the model of compliance, and yet his reward for her obedience was continued indifference. Her standing up was not a dramatic, table-pounding explosion, but a cool, calculated dismantling of his victim narrative. Kody, unaccustomed to being challenged with such clear-eyed logic from Meri, reacted with the trademark deflection of a narcissist whose script has been flipped. He could not address the substance of her question, the profound loneliness she highlighted, so he attacked the delivery. He accused her of being negative, of not being a safe person, of rehashing old grievances. But Meri held her ground. The heat of the feud was no longer just anger, it was the white-hot light of truth finally being spoken aloud. She refused to let him twist the narrative. She was not complaining about the rules, she was demonstrating their futility in the context of their relationship. The real virus in the family wasn't COVID-19, it was Kody's resentment and his blatant favoritism, and Meri was now boldly announcing her own antibodies. The heat in this feud was generated by the friction of Meri's newfound resilience grinding against the immovable object of Kody's ego. For the first time, she was not seeking his approval, she was presenting him with an invoice for 30 years of emotional debt, and his insolvency was on full display. The ripple effects of Meri's stand were instantaneous and profound. For Christine and Janelle, it was a moment of validation. They had long borne the brunt of Kody's mercurial moods and witnessed the unfairness of his dynamic with Robin. To see Meri, often the outsider, articulate the shared injustice so clearly was empowering. It gave them a vocabulary for their own frustrations and, perhaps, the courage to eventually make their own stands, leading to their own departures. For Robin, the supposed good wife, it was a threat. Meri's defiance exposed the fragility of the system Robin benefited from. If the foundational wife could be so thoroughly discarded, what did that say about the security of her own position? and for Kody, it was an existential crisis. Meri's calm confrontation was a direct challenge to his self-image as the patriarch whose word was law. He could not control her through guilt or manipulation anymore. She had called his bluff, and in doing so, she had fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the entire family. Ultimately, Meri's stand in that heated feud was far more than an argument about pandemic rules. It was her declaration of independence. It was the moment the scapegoat stopped accepting the blame and turned to face the accuser. While she did not immediately leave, that confrontation was the death knell for her romantic attachment to Kody and her blind faith in the principle of plural marriage as he practiced it. It marked the end of her fighting for Kody's love and the beginning of her fighting for herself. The woman who emerged from that verbal fire was scarred, yes, but also tempered, stronger, and finally free from the desperate need for validation from a man who had none to give. The family feud did not just expose the cracks in the Brown family foundation, it revealed that one of its pillars had chosen to stop holding up the crumbling ceiling and had instead decided to walk out into the open air, leaving Kody to rage in the ruins of a kingdom he himself had destroyed. In that 1,500-word paragraph of heated exchange, Meri Brown wrote the most important sentence of her life, the end. Kody Brown's sprawling and fragile ego was thick enough to taste a noxious cocktail of stale perfume, unshed tears, and the acrid scent of a family covenant burning to ash. This wasn't the usual skirmish in the long-running war of the Brown family, this was the moment the Western Front collapsed. For years, the family dynamic had been a precarious ecosystem built on a foundation of one man's whims, with Meri Brown orbiting its periphery like a ghost, a spectral reminder of a foundational love that had long since curdled into a polite, and then not so polite, burden. She was the first wife, the pioneer who had signed on for a grand celestial adventure, only to find herself relegated to the role of inconvenient footnote, her value measured not by shared history but by her dwindling utility in Kody's ever-shifting blueprint for patriarchal dominance. The current heated family feud, ostensibly about loyalty, COVID protocols, and the fracturing of the so-called family culture, was merely the spark. The tinder had been laid over a decade of neglect, public humiliations, and the slow, soul-crushing realization that her sacrifice had been for a kingdom that no longer wanted its queen. And on this night, as Kody held court, his voice a weaponized crescendo of blame directed at everyone but the man in the mirror, something in Meri finally broke, not into pieces, but into a sharp, unyielding blade of clarity. The ghost decided to speak, and when she did, her voice was not the timid, pleading whisper he had grown accustomed to dismissing, but a low, steady tremor that carried the weight of 29 years of silenced grievances. He was in full performance mode, pacing before his captive audience of wives and a few adult children, a preacher whose gospel was his own victimhood. He gesticulated wildly, his famous curls bouncing with self-righteous indignation, laying the entire collapse of their plural marriage at the feet of Janelle's independence, Christine's disloyalty, and the collective failure of the family to kiss his ass, a phrase he used with a shocking lack of irony. He was drawing his lines in the sand, demanding absolute fealty, and the subtext was screamingly clear: comply or be exiled. Meri sat quietly, a study in contained stillness, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes, usually shadowed with a deep, familiar sorrow, were calculating, tracing the arc of his hypocrisy with the cold precision of a bomb disposal expert. He had spent years telling her, both explicitly and through a brutal campaign of emotional withdrawal, that she was a problem to be managed, a disappointment to be endured. He had famously compared his relationship with her to a pot of soup he simply didn't want to eat, a moment of such profound dehumanization that it should have been the end, but for her, it was just another scar in a tapestry of them. Now, watching him demand from others the very devotion he had systematically denied her, a dam of biblical proportions finally gave way. It wasn't a burst of anger, it was a glacial shift, the tectonic plates of her soul realigning after centuries of seismic pressure. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice to match his. Instead, she lowered it, forcing the entire room to lean into her silence, to actively listen for the first time in years. "Kody," she began, and the single word cut through his bluster like a scalpel. He stopped mid-pace, startled by the tone, which held none of the desperate hope he was used to hearing. It was flat, final, and terrifyingly calm. You've been talking for an hour about loyalty. About what a wife owes her husband. About the sacrifices required to keep this family together. She paused, letting the words hang in the toxic air. Every eye was on her, even Christine, usually a fountain of reactive commentary, was frozen, watching a revolution she had never believed she would see. I have been loyal to you, Meri continued, her gaze locked on his, unblinking. I have been loyal past the point of reason, past the point of dignity. I stood by you after the catfishing scandal, when I was publicly shamed and you offered me not comfort, but contempt. I have sat in this family, year after year, watching you build new lives, new loves, new homes, while I was left with the empty shell of a marriage you abandoned long before anyone ever heard the word COVID. This was different. This wasn't Meri playing the victim, this was Meri presenting evidence. She was methodically dismantling the narrative he had constructed, brick by self-justifying brick. You talk about the family culture crumbling, she said, a bitter, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. What culture is that, Kody? The culture where one man's feelings dictate the emotional weather for 24 people? The culture where a wife's worth is determined by her compliance? You have spent years telling me I'm not enough. That I'm difficult. That I'm a problem. You pushed me to the outskirts and then blamed me for living there. You asked me to stay in a relationship with you where the only thing you required of me was my presence at family functions, a ghost at the feast.